Maybe no time in American history was more thrilling than the Wild West. One false move and you were history. Think you could have hacked it? Time to put on your cowboy hat and find out. Count 10 paces, buckaroo. This is Epicot 2. Survive the Wild West. When people talk about the Wild West, they're referring to a period of American expansionism that began with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and ended around 1912, when New Mexico and Arizona were officially made states. During this time, thousands of Americans migrated westward for a variety of reasons: to own land, mine for gold, and to avoid religious persecution. Now, what was life in the Wild West actually like? If you were a cowboy, you lived on a ranch. The average cowboy was 24 years old and made very little money. Half of them were African American or Mexican. In fact, all of a cowboy's technique and training came from their Mexican equivalent, the vaquero. Mispronouncing that word is where we get the phrase buckaroo. You hear vaquero, and other people heard buckaroo. If you went on a ranch, you'd live in a town. Wild West towns were small, usually with a population of around 500 or less, with important buildings like a sheriff's office, saloon, general store, and bank located within a few feet of each other. I knew this because I played Red Dead Redemption. An entire town could be no more than 25 feet wide. These small towns fostered a sense of community. Residents took care of one another and looked out for each other. Some of the possible jobs you'd have include merchant, carpenter, banker, blacksmith, or sheriff, if you were a guy, and school teacher or prostitute if you were a woman. Yeah, it was not a good time to be a woman. Gambling, public drunkenness, fights, and prostitution were common occurrences as local law enforcement was spread too thin and U.S. Marshals were too far away to tackle smaller, lesser crimes. So, what did you have to look out for in the Wild West? Two of the biggest killers were wild animals and severe weather. Mountain lions, bears, and rattlesnakes were everywhere and were the primary reason people carried firearms. Hot summers, which could reach temperatures of up to 120 degrees, were a big problem, especially in days without air conditioning. Droughts and tornadoes were also common. Winter was no better. Blizzards were so bad that horses and cattle died when their breath froze over their noses, suffocating them. That is a nightmare. Animal nightmare. But what was the most dangerous part of the Wild West, you ask? A surprise attack from Native Americans? No, actually, settlers and Native Americans rarely got into skirmishes. Records indicate that of the thousands of settlers, only a few hundred were killed by Native Americans. How about disease? While illness was a common threat in the West, if you lived in a town, deaths by disease were kept surprisingly under control. Healthcare out west was actually better than it was back east. The town of Tombstone had 5 hospitals. During an outbreak of smallpox there, every single resident was quickly vaccinated and nobody died. The biggest threat that you had to look out for in the Wild West were bandits and outlaws. Look at that! We're into stereotypes. This is great. Now it's going to get like the places that you are familiar with. Jesse James was one of the Wild West's most notorious outlaws. One of the leaders of the James Younger gang, Jesse helped rob trains and stagecoaches in Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, Texas, Arkansas, Kansas, and West Virginia. Billy the Kid, born William Henry McCarty, was an infamous outlaw with an even more famous temper. Legend has it that Billy killed 21 people, but that number was likely exaggerated by the man who finally gunned Billy down, Sheriff Patrick Garrett. Black Bart robbed at least 28 stagecoaches across Northern California from 1875 to 1883. Strangely, he was afraid of horses, and made all of his robberies while on foot. Black Bart might have been the most polite outlaw, as he never swore, never fired his weapon, and left poems behind after his robberies. Dear John, you got robbed. If you thought you'd be worried about getting into a gunfight with one of these outlaws, you should have just sat down and relaxed. Contrary to popular belief, the Wild West wasn't full of gunfights. Actually, towns like Deadwood, Dodge City, and Tombstone had some of the strictest gun control laws in the country. Inside city limits, only law enforcement was allowed to open carry. Visitors were required to drop off all firearms with the local sheriff. Even one of the most violent and infamous shootouts in the history of the Wild West was relatively tame. The shootout at the OK Corral had only 6 casualties and lasted less than 30 seconds. Shootouts like these were less of a daily occurrence and more of a freak anomaly due to organized crime. Your best bet in these situations is to stay far away. Gunfights of the time took place at extremely close range. Pistols of the era lacked the range and accuracy of modern firearms and were near useless beyond 50 feet. Gunslingers would hit bystanders more often than their opponent. You might also want to stay sober. Most Wild West gunfights weren't planned, but the result of tempers flaring in the heat of the moment, and often because of the influence of alcohol. You'd most likely encounter these outlaws during one of their robberies, so how can you come out of it alive? Your best bet to avoid a robbery entirely is to stay close to town and away from stagecoaches and trains. Those were much more likely to be robbed than banks. Since towns were small, banks were usually located right next to the sheriff's office. Stagecoaches and trains were more isolated and therefore easier to rob without getting caught. But if you did find yourself on a train or stagecoach being robbed, your best bet to survive is to just shut up and hand over your money. Like today. In the Wild West, robberies were extremely commonplace. 129 reported stagecoach robberies took place between 1875 and 1903 in Arizona alone. And it hasn't gotten any better since. And more than half of those robberies went unsolved. Robberies were so common that stagecoach passengers started viewing them as part of the experience and actually complained to stage companies if they weren't held up. But if you really didn't want to be robbed, your best chance was to be a lady. Many bandits wouldn't rob women, as it was considered dishonorable. So that's one good thing about being a lady in the West. Go ladies! Now, you may be asking, hey Joe, what if I have no choice but to face my opponent in a classic shootout? What then? Well, fear not, loyal viewer, here's what to remember. Size up the situation as quickly as possible. Keep an eye out for any advantage. For instance, if you keep your back to the sun, he'll be staring straight into the light, which will force him to squint, throwing off his aim. Take advantage of any distractions like blowing dust or panicking horses, or talking horses. He'd be like, what the? And then he's dead. Also, be prepared for equipment failure. Guns broke or misfired all the time, and you won't exactly have time to fix it in the middle of a fight, so keep spares on hand, and you might just make it out of the gunfight alive. There you have it. You did it. You survived in the Wild West. Bye. Let us know what topic you guys think we should break down next in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.